Well, good day. How are we, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Zell, also known as Michael, which is my actual name. And today we are going to be, reading the book of Matthew, which is the first book in the New Testament. I don't know how many people are actually interested in watching that or listening to that or anything like that. And it's not really a big deal. I think there's a lot of stigma these days in reading a book that a lot of people consider holy, set apart, which is basically what the word holy means, set aside and, special in its own way. I think it is a really important historical text. There are people who argue that it is not historical, that it is biased and full of stories that are fantastical and, not for this day and age. And yet at the same time, it is a story about a man who at least seemed to claim implicitly and explicitly that he was God. And that people believe this. And I was once myself a hardened atheist, person who in particularly really despised Christians. And it took me going to jail and studying. My usual thing is that I went kicking and screaming into Christianity. And that's because I really didn't want to become a Christian. I didn't really want to understand what the story had to do with, my life or anybody's life for that matter, or the world or the bigger questions in life, even though I'm the type of person who really desires, a lot of that stuff. So, hey, Shoes, how's it going, bro? That's what we're going to be reading. I know Lunar is running a little bit behind. They're going to be on camera here. I have sort of a reactive image. You can kind of see them just hanging out there before they jump in here, and that's fine. So I'm just going to kind of go through a few introductory things about the story of the Bible. We're going to start in the New Testament because I find that that's a little bit, high static. Lunar, exactly. I think people I don't know how much people even know about the story. It's usually put up in the same area as holy books like the Quran. It's hooked up into the same way. It's actually got a lot of the Jewish texts. It is fundamentally about a Jewish guy. Jesus is Jewish. And so the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, that the Christian Bible, and everything like that. I'm not religious anymore, but I love that you're doing this. Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate that. I've had quite a bit of a journey with Christianity and with religion in general. So my story basically kind of goes back. I was raised Catholic, essentially. So I went to Catholic school, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who were taken to church in my generation that didn't necessarily really truly understand what was going on. Why are we going to this building? Why are we saying these things and eating this piece of cracker or bread or something like that and drinking this wine and that kind of stuff? Went to Catholic school. Nice. Yeah. And so I just think that there's quite a large divorce between, the prior generations that were really inundated and the belief that God exists in the person of Jesus and everything like that. That was just kind of assumed. That was just how people were raised. And then it didn't necessarily get translated all that well to a generation that, started to grow up in a very modern and now postmodern society where, information comes at you super fast and ideas and competing religions even and different worldviews that they were just available. And so it kind of all, I think, got into sort of a generalized spirituality, or I think the opposite in terms of my case. It became sort of a modern atheism to some degree, a rejection of the divine or a rejection of anything supernatural. Everything can be quantified, it's everything science and math, and you can predict. And so you have those shifting worldviews and those competing worldviews at that, in a world that is more and more open to communication and open to having a lot of different information. And so for me to get to the point that I would even listen to a person who claimed to be a Christian or said they were a Christian, it took me going to prison, basically ruining my entire life, basing it off of an atheistic and nihilistic worldview. And I'm not saying that all atheists necessarily, are nihilists. And so maybe I should explain that a little bit. So a nihilist is somebody who basically says there is no ultimate meaning of life, and therefore there is no meaning of life other than what you make of it. And fundamentally, whether you live like Hitler or Mother Teresa, it doesn't matter in the end, because we all die and there's nothing at the end of everything, and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the philosophical view that I had. And in my mind, I didn't have a lot of self-worth and everything like that, did a lot of terrible stuff, and ended up in prison. And it was I actually do attribute a good portion of that to my worldview. Is if you really believe that you don't matter and nobody else matters, and that life doesn't matter, then you can really convince yourself to do some pretty crazy stuff. And that's exactly what happened to me. And so my journey essentially led me to doing a serious crime, and then turning myself in for that crime, and recognizing a level of guilt, and recognizing that my worldview didn't make sense. If I really believed that nothing really mattered and that I could just do whatever I wanted, then I wouldn't feel that guilty. I wouldn't have that remorse, and I wouldn't have also experienced some things that I didn't really understand. Things that, logically, at least at the time, I didn't think were possible. And so it made me pause on my self-destructive behavior and really start asking these really deep, important questions. So I dived into philosophy, which is sort of the larger questions of life, trying to find that knowledge of those deeper questions. And psychology, I still struggle with some mental health stuff. I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 2 and PTSD. So that, combined with my worldview, really made things crazy. Not to misuse that word, I guess, but yeah, it didn't help, that's for sure. And so I need to get psychological help, and especially with my anger. So I went and I took a course called the Aggressive Behavior Control Program. So I would stop being so angry and acting out aggressively or passive aggressively. So much more assertive and much more open-minded, I think. And it actually became, my study of psychology and philosophy and, different topics, just because I was bored mainly and had lots of time to read whilst you're inside. That I started to look into theology, because philosophy only gets you so far. It's kind of self-contained within the human sphere, how humans think, or what the purpose of life within a human level of things. But as soon as you start asking outside of one's own locus of control, one's own species even, and asking, well, is there anything beyond that? Is there anything above that sort of thing? That's when you get into the theos, the divine, the logos, the greatest conceivable good is another way that you can sort of discuss it, I guess. And so, I hated Christianity. I hated Christians in particular, and I had a particular view of Christians and a particular experience that I sort of just copy and pasted into my mind, without actually diving too deeply into what exactly do Christians believe, let alone how do real Christians behave versus the perception of them, right? There are some who claim to be Christians all around the world that, based on the actual objective definition of what a Christian is, one who follows Christ and does what he is asked of you, sort of thing, that those things are really disparate. They're disparate. There's a big difference between them. And so I needed to learn that. But before I needed to learn that, I basically, again, I went kicking and screaming into Christianity. I didn't want to really learn about it. I was pretty hostile towards it, even after all the aggressive behavior control stuff. And so I started off with Buddhism first. And so the Buddhists, from my cursory knowledge of it, I don't claim to be an expert in anything, frankly. That's why it's called Amateur Apologetics, which comes from the word amour, which is to love something. So I love to learn, and I love to make a defense of, in this case, Christianity, but if anything, I like being the devil's advocate even. So I can take I can go back and put myself in the shoes of somebody who was an atheist, because I used to be, and say, well, that doesn't make sense, and I disagree with that, or, let's dig deeper into this sort of thing. And so, again, that's where the amateur apologetics comes from. The apologetics word comes from the word apologia, which just means to make a defense of something. And so this is sort of a cursory glance of reading the Bible, making a defense of what its story says, whether or not it's true. I mean, that's something for everybody to decide on their own. And but yeah, in terms of my getting there, the Buddhist teachings really ironically helped me move towards that direction, because so they have something called the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, and one of those first things is to recognize the impermanence of everything. And so it's one of their first paths, is to recognize that everything in the world is changing and shifting, and if you try and hold on to it, if you try to make it something other than it is, that is actually the cause of suffering. And that's a really important principle to realize. And I don't dismiss a lot of the teachings of a lot of different religions, because they're touching on truth at some level, right? And that's what my personal desire is to find a foundational objective truth on how one ought to live. And encourage others, whether by my own actions and doing those things, because you do the things that you really believe in. If you didn't believe in them, then at some level, then you wouldn't do those things, right? So you eat food not just because you have an internal desire, but because you think it's a good thing to do it, sort of thing. You drink water, same thing. And this to some degree goes implicitly to the actions of whether something you do is right or wrong in a moral sense as well. So people do moral or immoral things because they believe them to be either morally correct, morally incorrect, or morally neutral. They say, well, it doesn't matter if I actually do this, and whether they've convinced themselves of that, or they've been brought up that way, or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, that's the way, that's the way humans work. And so the principle with the Buddhist thing for me was really important to learn. And it's such a simple concept, like, unless you're really wanting to wrestle with it, like you think it's like, oh, well, duh, right? But at the same time, if you recognize the two concepts of that trying to make something that is impermanent stay or be something other than it is, that's actually what's causing a lot of your suffering, that's a pretty big idea, whether you vocalize it and whether you've really chewed on it, meditated on it at all. And that's a really, that's what really started me on a different journey, I think. And so what made me angry the most is having this concept, or having this idea of how the world ought to work, and it not being that way, and me trying to fit the world into this mold and saying it's got to be like this, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure it's just and it's good, and that people act rightly and everything like that. And that just eventually got snowballed into causing my own suffering. Now, there's limits to that, I think, but it certainly alleviated a great deal of my anger. So it helped me get to a point where I was actually able to say once. So I was in a jail cell, my jail cell, and I had a buddy in jail with me. He'd come to visit my cell, and I was bragging one day, and I said, I'm pretty okay. And my anger's a lot better, and you know what, I'm actually so open-minded, much more open-minded than I used to. I'm so glad about it that I'm willing to listen to anybody's point of view on virtually any topic and at least hear them out. And without missing a beat, I had no idea who this guy was, what his background was and everything like that. But without missing a beat, this guy goes, "That's awesome, man. You should come down to this to the chapel in prison here, and they have a Bible study. I think at the time it was like on Sundays or something like that, or it might be Tuesdays. I can't remember. They switched around here and there. But we have this Bible study on Tuesdays. You should come down. There's a bunch of volunteers and just hear what they have to say." And my initial reaction was to curl up into a ball of like, oh my, like disgust, really, is really what it was, and say, there's no freaking way I'm going to a church. There's no way I'm going to go listen to a bunch of Christians. That's cultish. That's crazy. That's nonsense. And that was all my prior view of things. And I hadn't really changed. I had just said, however, that I was much more open-minded. And, well, push comes to shove, I am a very prideful person, and because I said something, I have to back it up. And that's what you do in prison anyway. If you say something, you got to give your word, right? They say word, and you say, yeah, totally, word. And as a confirmation that you are truthful, you are honest, and you have to back that up. And if you aren't, then, especially in jail, you're called a squid, or you're, all these different words to knock you down and to push you out and discredit you, essentially. And so I had to follow through with what I said. And so, I said, yeah, sure. I'm sure I'll go. That sounds like a great idea. And in the end, what ended up happening was I was really hoping that this guy, by the way, this guy's name was Turtle. His nickname was Turtle. He was a chunkier guy, about my height, 5'7"-ish, 5'8", whatever he was. And, but he was one of the coolest guys, tattooed like from the neck down. His entire body was tattooed. He was I think he was Irish Scottish background, if I remember correctly. But regular Canadian guy overall. But yeah, Turtle. So he said, yeah, I'll come grab you the next time we have this Bible study, and it was at night, and so these volunteers came from Alberta, so I was in Alberta, Canada. They're in a small town called Three Hills, and they would drive up without, nobody paid them, nobody did anything. They were just volunteers, and they came to run this little Bible study for about an hour and a half, something like that, on the weekday. And that day came, I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. Like I said, they changed it around. And the doors opened after supper. We were locked up between those times, just afterwards. And we had free period, and we got, the thing with the Bible study was called out on the range, and I didn't get up or I didn't do anything, hoping that Turtle would have forgotten that he had invited me to this thing. But sure enough, with Bible in hand, this tattooed, gangster kind of guy, he was a drug dealer, came to my cell and said, all right, let's go. And so I went, and I wasn't convinced the first day or the first 3 days. I told myself that I would go 3 times to show how open-minded I was, right? To listen 3 times. But what changed me, or what started changing my attitude, was the actual people. What I expected from Christians, and this is my point. What I expected from Christians was for them to be judgmental and harsh. And if you don't believe what I believe, then you're evil. You're morally reprehensible if you don't follow through with this. And that's not what I got from those people that came in. They were volunteers. They had no apparent agenda. They just came, they believed in what they believed, and they came and they shared. And the irony of what they were doing, at least for the type of person I was they were basically, in my mind at that time, wasting their time with a bunch of convicts sharing this story, and it bothered me that these very nice people, extremely nice, well-meaning, soft-hearted people were, in my mind, helping a bunch of people that were unredeemable. They are not, like, if you've been to prison, then you know that a good portion of them likely won't change their ways. And that's a harsh reality, and that's a harsh thing to say, and I don't mean that it's not possible, but in my experience, like, the recidivism rate currently in Canada, last time I checked, was like 80%. So 80% of the people who go into jail will eventually come back to jail. That's crazy, you know? It sounds good, Lunar. Thanks. Appreciate you. No worries. But yeah, so once I got to that point, you'd think, oh, you know, I had this radical conversion experience. I didn't. I actually had the opposite effect. I said, these people are wasting their time being here, and I need to save them from their cult-like, you know, their you know, this Jesus thing or whatever. So I'm going to disprove Christianity. And that's actually how I started engaging with the text that we're going to be reading today. I started with Matthew, and I just started, so just going from there. And I was given, so I had a few friends there. So the main guy, his name was Neville, and he was the one who was running it. And he was a very old school fire and brimstone kind of preacher guy with the softest heart in the world, regardless. You know, he believed what he believed, and he said he thought there were consequences to believing one thing or another, right? If you do believe, there are consequences, and if you don't believe, there are consequences. And that's true for everything in life. And he just believed it on this particular issue. And then the other guy was Grant, and so I've had Grant on my podcast and everything like that, and yeah, I absolutely was welcomed to basically rail against the dying of the light. You know, he's like, if you are angry at Christians, or if you have a problem with the Bible or anything like that, express them. Feel free to be as harsh and questioning and hard-nosed atheist, you know, logic person as you want. Anything that you want to do when you're engaging with us, do it. And he welcomed that with open arms, and I was not expecting that. And so my whole quest was to disprove Christianity with this guy helping me out. So he said, if you ever have a question or anything, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I'll figure them out with you. We'll work with it together. And that's how I intend to run this whole thing. Hey, Matt. A big problem with it is also that it's hard to live outside prison once you've been in. Harder to get a real job. People expect you to be like you were before. Absolutely true. Yeah, no, 100%. It's a totally different... It's a different culture in there. And you have to... There's a level of survival that you have to experience that once you're out of that culture, it's difficult to just forget, to get out of it, to not have to experience anymore, right? And so when I first got out, I was on red alert all the time, right? Like, I was always hyper aware. I was worried about cops. I was worried about anybody who was looking at me, because whilst you're in there, you're always kind of getting a side glance. They're always trying to measure you up. You're always trying to tell you, what can I get out of this guy? What can I do to this guy? What can this guy give me? You know, that sort of thing. And so you get hyper aware, and you think that when you get out, that everybody's like that whoever's looking at you, they have some agenda, or they're calculating, or they're judging you, or something like that. And that's difficult to just shrug off, especially if you've been in several times, or worse, for me, it was, close to 5 years. So yeah, it was not fun, but yeah, no, good point. And it is difficult for those who get out, and it's not, and it's, yeah, I mean, and it kind of goes back to my point, though, is like, some of those things are societally, it just makes it harder for those guys who do want to change to even get to that point. But there's still the level of personal responsibility too. Like, some people are just addicted, some of them are sick. And I do believe that addiction is a sickness, it's an illness, that they've gotten into one thing or the other, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever it is, and those lower your ability to deal with reality in the first place. And so if you put a bunch of other obstacles in your way, the likelihood of succeeding outside is lower and lower, right? So, but yeah, so all that to be said, what I want to try and accomplish, or not even accomplish, my agenda the first time I did this was to disprove Christianity. I obviously didn't come to that conclusion at the end, and I don't expect anybody else to be swayed one way or the other. It is just an engagement with the text for people's knowledge, and should they desire to know more or ask questions or really get down to the nitty-gritty of what we're doing here, whether that's on a personal end, I'm willing to throw myself out there and walk with people. And so I'm doing it in a public sphere with my sibling. So Lunar Smiles will be joining me here in a moment, as they've said. And yeah, we'll go from there. I'll read a few things. We'll probably go for the first 3 chapters, because that's kind of the way that Matthew's kind of broken up into different parts. It's more implicit. You have to kind of do some textual criticism, is what it's called, to figure out, okay, well, what's the purpose of and how's the structure of this book made, kind of thing. But yeah, the saying "they've paid their debt" is just that, words. So many people will say that, but those same people wouldn't hire a convict or even spend much time with them. It's absolutely true. Yeah, and I'm not saying that that's not wrong to some degree. Some of those, you need to be discerning. There are some guys who get out and they haven't changed. They have that past, and the way people judge people, even in their own families and everything like that, is based on past actions. And if you're divorced from a personal relationship with somebody, right, and all you have is the record of their good and bad actions, most of the time we're always going to prioritize the bad, because that's how humans are wired, right? We prioritize safety. We judge to protect ourselves, and we don't want to be, if there's somebody who's embezzling money in the past, we say, okay, well, the likelihood that he'll do that again is high. At least it's higher than the person who has never done that. And I'm not blaming people who think that way. But at the same time, our ability as a society to, especially whilst people are inside, to recognize where they are and get them to a point that is pro-social, where the past doesn't matter, where they've kind of overcome that, and it's been proven with their stuff. That whole system is terrible. Let alone, as what you've said, once they're in the community, having the community itself to embrace them and to be able to help them out is just as bad, if not way worse. So it really is quite a difficult time, I must say. So yeah. But yeah, thanks for joining us, guys, especially you, Matt, and appreciate you coming by. What I'll probably do is what I have is, and I'll even show you guys. Oh my god. So I have a tome and a half because I'm psycho. This is my Bible. It is an apologetics Bible, and it's filled with all sorts of notes, and I have a bunch of stuff in the back as well. So this is called an apologetics Bible. So it's a Bible that is written, it's a particularly odd version. It's a version called the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Which is just a fancy way of saying that it is kind of middle ground between two different. Whoa, that is a Bible. That's right. So it's got the whole thing. We're starting in the New Testament in Matthew, and so this one has not just the Bible in it, but it has different articles and different notes for each passage. Not every one, but like a lot of the passages. That bring up different questions that can come up when you're actually talking about the Bible, or now these are sometimes historical questions. Sometimes they have to do with logical questions. They can deal with philosophy and theology broadly, that might make people stumble and say, well, that doesn't make sense, or that's full of garbage, or, these people are idiots, or whatever it is. And it's meant to be sort of a tool to be used to support, or to say, well, actually, if you look at it in this way, and this is the logic behind why they're doing this. People write not always in a linear fashion. So a lot of the biblical script, a lot of the books are actually written, with a certain structure in mind. So it's actually a fairly new phenomenon for there to be sort of a linear temporal or chronological expression of a story. Most stories in the past, most even historical documents, will actually frame or change the events of things happening, and it was perfectly legitimate to do it because it was meant to be expressing a more dramatic or more just a different expression of truth. And so, for example, some of the things that we read in Matthew, when you read in the next book, so you have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the order of things that happen are totally different. And so you say, well, that means that the Bible's wrong, you know? Well, it's like, no, they're put into certain orders, or the stories are told in a certain way so that they will express a particular angle or a particular view of what's happening in the story events. It's not that they're not true, it's that they have a purpose behind it. And that's actually pretty normal, especially in the ancient world. So in first century Judea, which is what this is essentially covering, it's yeah. Is this going to be a regular thing? I can only be here till about 2 today. I have other plans. No, absolutely. This is going to be every Sunday, at least, you know, whether Lunar joins, or I know Yellowhammer 50 he wanted to join as well, but he's out camping, so he'll probably join next week. So yeah, anybody else who wants to join, they're certainly welcome to participate. But yeah, I plan on doing this every Sunday, noon Eastern. So, but we're not going to go too far. I'm going to try and just basically go for an hour or so, and that's basically the goal. Looks good. Why not? Okay, so I've taken a few pictures of the pages that I have in this massive tome. Like I said, it's ridiculously large. And then I'll read off of the other thing. Matt says, the idea of inconsistencies in the four Gospels disproving the Bible has already been dispelled by I think it was a police specialist. In fact, it makes it more likely to be true. The idea that if you ask 10 people about what they witnessed, you get 10 different but similar stories. Exactly. Actually, yeah. So there's been a lot of different work, and this is the whole concept of apologetics, right? Is if you were to ask, people will say it's like the game of telephone, right? Every time you share the story, it gets changed and everything like that. And then until it becomes completely different. And that's an argument that the Bible and the books cannot possibly be real. Except there's a problem with that, several problems with that apologetically. One is there are written copies. There are written versions of the story. And so it's not that somebody says the story and then it goes and said to another person. It's like somebody says the story and then they go back to the original documents. They're like, oh yeah, that's true. And then if somebody says something that's wrong, it's like, oh, actually that's not true. And so they can keep going back and checking everything like that. But yeah, the idea that eyewitness testimony is thrown out in court is very, very clearly incorrect. And so it's been shown by police detectives and everything like that eyewitness testimony is actually very important factual information during a case. And so if you take it as if an investigator or a journalist or something like that who's looking for the facts and things, then eyewitness testimony is a perfectly legitimate thing that you have in a court of law. And if you apply that same thing to the scripture, seeing secondary or tertiary details change is totally to be expected. But the primary details, this particular main character did this thing in this place, they are almost always the same across all accounts. And that's what you see with the Bible. So that's called textual criticism, right? So you're really looking into the text of things and trying to figure it out. So okay, so do you want to read as well, or do you just want me to read and then like kind of say, yeah, I have a question. That's bullshit.
I can read as well, okay. I guess.
Let me.
Just off of.
Did you want me to? Did you want me to? I can share my.
In Discord.
Yeah. Give me a second, guys. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I've talked a lot, so I'll let you read this first part. If you have any question that pops up during a sentence or a paragraph, don't feel like you can't This is basically the article that's in my book. It's an introduction to the book of Matthew, gives a little bit of the background, when it was thought to be written, who it was written by, that sort of stuff, which isn't necessarily, solid, right? So there are questions. There are legitimate things that are like, well, that doesn't make sense, or I'm not sure what's going on. And I think that's perfectly fine. So, yeah, if you want to go ahead, this is the start with the author.
Okie dokie. Author. Nowhere does the first gospel name its author, though the title, according to Matthew, was probably added early in the book's history, most likely around the beginning of the 2nd century. The book was not quoted as Matthew's gospel until Irenaeus, a bishop of Lyon,
yep.
Lyon, did so around AD 180. Earlier documents quoting Matthew, going back to the same period as the title or earlier, do not name the gospel from which the quotes came. According to the sources available, the early church was in unanimous agreement that the apostle Matthew was the first to write a gospel, and that he originally did so in Hebrew or Aramaic. Irenaeus was the first to explicitly claim this, and it was repeated thereafter with relative frequency. The claim seems to stem, at least in part, from Papias, a bishop in Asia Minor, written around AD 130. Want me to keep going?
Yeah, if you're
till the end of the page.
Yeah,
sure. The 4th century church historian Eusebius cited Papias. Is it Papias or Papias? I'm
Papias.
sure.
I kind of go Papias. I don't know. I'm not Greek.
Papias, exactly. As affirming that Matthew arranged Jesus' sayings in Hebrew or Aramaic, and each interpreted them as best as he could. This sentence from Eusebius has provoked considerable scholarly debate. Was Papias saying that Matthew wrote a gospel, or merely that he wrote an orderly collection of Jesus' sayings? Was he claiming Matthew wrote in Hebrew or Aramaic, or in Greek with a Semitic flavor? Did people try to translate Matthew's work into Greek? At one end of the spectrum, Papias may have been saying that Matthew arranged in Hebrew the sayings of Jesus, or perhaps just OT testimony? OT?
Old Testament. Yeah.
Right. About Jesus. At the other end of the spectrum, Papias may have been talking about a complete gospel account, such as the Gospel of Matthew that we know. Certainly, the church fathers understood the latter to be the case, and Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin c. 380, even insisted that he was given access to the Hebrew original possessed by the Nazareans, a Jewish Christian sect. The problem for modern scholarship is that Matthew's gospel shows few signs of having been translated into Greek from an earlier Semitic text. It appears much more likely to be an original Greek composition, though scholars thus disagree over whether or not that's true, is what I assume.
I'll just zoom in here.
Anything you wanted to add or talk about in that?
Yeah, C is circa around the time of, essentially. So thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I was going to say we'll continue on here. There's a couple more pages. One of the things that will probably come up, I'm not as well learned about the history stuff as I'd like to be. The history of the church and the history of the Bible, I'm a little less competent at. Logical argumentation on theology is more my wheel game, whether or not something makes sense, and the probability of God existing and exponentially going. That's more where I feel more comfortable. But one of the things with the argument about Matthew, basically what this is kind of bringing up is Matthew likely wasn't wasn't translated from a Hebrew source, which is, you know, basically what the Jewish people spoke, right? So they were Hebrews, and they had that primary language. So the question is, and it'll probably come up here, is whether or not Matthew just wrote in Greek, which isn't what most scholars were saying. And in fact, that's not what basically one of these church fathers, I think it was Eusebius, is what we were saying. He said that he had the original Hebrew. Well, we don't have that. We don't have that particular text, and it doesn't look like the text that we have currently, the earliest existing copies, that those came from a Hebrew source. They look like they were directly written as a Greek scholarship. So that's actually really interesting. Much of the New Testament was written in Greek, right? And that's because that was the language of the day, right? Even though Rome and everything like that was the primary ruler, you'll find out in this time period, the Greeks had a lot to do with actually the education of that world of first century and prior of peoples. So Greek was the most common language at the time. So anyway, if you want to continue. You
can go ahead and sure. You can read from there. I'm doing my facial treatment since I just got out of the shower.
Sounds good. Papias was wrong to insist on Matthean Hebrew original, or whether he was correct but was referring to something written in Hebrew that was different from our first gospel. Right. So they're basically asking, you know, was the original Matthew collection just a collection of Jesus's sayings, and it wasn't actually a story about Jesus's life and death and resurrection and all that stuff? And so that's what one of the explanations are given is like, oh, maybe what he had actual access to was just Jesus's sayings, not the actual Gospel of Matthew that we have today, which is possible, you know. But I like that there's a little bit of controversy. There's a little bit of unknown to it. It's I don't know, if it was just all people had the same story, you know, then it wouldn't be history. You know, history isn't exact science. It's got, you know, winners and losers, and one of those, you know, those old sayings is, you know, that history is written by the victor kind of thing, right? And so you're going to have these varying accounts and have these questions, and I think that's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate in the sphere of historical criticism or historical documents. So okay. Other church fathers besides Jerome reported a Hebrew gospel existing in their day associated with Jewish Christians. They agreed that it was in many respects different from the biblical Matthew, though connected with that apostle. If the latter is the case, our first gospel is neither written by Matthew or is the second work written by him, this time in Greek. It could be that Papias confused the two works and assumed one was the basis for the other. The best evidence from the gospel itself that Matthew was its author is that only in the gospel is Levi the tax collector in Mark 2:14 and Luke 5:27 identified as the apostle Matthew in Matthew 9:9 and 10:3. At the very least, this suggests the author presents Matthew's witness. The gospel also contains clear evidence that the author possessed a strong command of both Aramaic and Greek, something that would be a prerequisite for most tax collectors. Furthermore, the author of Matthew used the more precise term nomisma for the coin used in the dispute over tribute in Matthew 22:19. Then Mark's and Luke's denarian in Mark 12:15 and Luke 20:24. This linguistic specificity strongly implies that the author was conversant in the fine details of money and finance, a point that would lend credence to the proposition that the author was a tax collector. So in other words, there's evidence in the writing itself that this guy was educated enough and familiar enough with currency to be a tax collector. So that's one of the evidences that they say, yeah, this actually probably was written by Matthew. Yo, what's good, Zelly? Tall boy Dane. Dane, how's it going, man? Been a while. Okay. Nevertheless, most critical scholars still reject Matthean authorship of the first gospel. Some argue that an apostle an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry would not have used a secondary source, yet the first gospel relies on Mark for much of its material. Others claim that the perspective of the book shows a fuller development of traditional material and of relations with the Jews than one might expect in an early gospel. Neither of these objections is telling. One could just as easily speculate that Mark's gospel, associated as it was with Peter, had gained so much acceptance as the first accurate narrative of Christ's life that Matthew saw no need to disregard it in his compiling of his own gospel. Another objection that Matthean authorship is the highly developed relationship between Jews and Gentiles. The same can be said for Paul's letters, which are indisputably from the apostolic age. Thus, there is no compelling reason to overturn the unanimous external evidence associating the first gospel with the apostle Matthew. So the date in terms of what this is about. One thing just before, one of the things that people argue is that the writer of the gospel had to be the same person as the person who's attributed. That's actually not too true, and we have that all the time with things like pen names, for example, or ghostwriters, right? So we have ghostwriters nowadays that, that person goes about compiling, a bunch of articles and writing a bunch of the material for the book, and then the author themselves compiles it or organizes it, edits it, and puts their own name on it. And it's actually a legitimate thing, and it's been like that for centuries. And so it's possible, and you'll see that with the book of Mark. Mark is called Mark because he's a friend to Peter, and Peter was just a fisherman, right? So Peter might not have been even able to write, for all we know. And so when it's the Gospel of Mark, it's likely, or it's been expressed, for example, that it could be just Peter saying, hey, Mark, write this down for me, right? And it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And so that attribution, and having multiple people sort of working on one project, that's another thing that sometimes comes up. So anyway, so for the date, Matthew is quoted by the church father Ignatius around AD 110, perhaps 15 years earlier in 1 Clement, and thus could not have been written much later than about AD 90. Most critical scholars opt for a date not much earlier than that for the same reasons that lead them to deny Matthean authorship. Because Matthew seems to betray knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, any date before AD 70 is presumed impossible. But besides prejudicially allowing that Jesus could have predicted Jerusalem's fall, the evidence for prophecy after the fact is not as clear as some suggest. First, the words of Christ in Matthew 22 and 24 are so general that one could easily understand them as indicating no knowledge of the actual destruction of Jerusalem. Second, certain episodes in Matthew give pre-AD 70 perspectives that would at least require clarifying comment from the gospel writer if the temple had already fallen. For example, the discussion of the temple tax in 1724 and 27. There is no reason, therefore, that the gospel could not have been written before AD 70. Irenaeus reported that Matthew... do we have more here? Yes. That Matthew was written was written while Peter and Paul preached at Rome, placing at least earlier versions of the gospel in the AD 60s, assuming Irenaeus had a reliable tradition. The precise date of the writing of Matthew is uncertain, but sometime in the 60s is not unreasonable. Finally, the themes. Each gospel, though broadly compatible with the others, emphasizes something different about the significance of the life and ministry of Jesus. For Matthew, the significance clearly lies in Jesus' status as the promised messianic son of David, the king of Israel. Several features of the gospel are related to the primary theme. Foremost is Matthew's citation of the Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in the life of Jesus. Matthew is often faulted for taking these prophecies out of context and misapplying them. However, his practice must be understood in terms of the conventions of first century citation generally, and the charge is less appropriate than is often thought to be. See the notes in chapter 2. Other features related to the theme of Jesus as promised king include long teaching discourses in which the word of Jesus becomes a new law for the church, a confession of Jesus as the Son of God in the divine, as opposed to merely messianic terms, and an extension of kingdom promises from Jews to the Gentile nations in fulfillment of the covenant with Abraham. For more on the similarities and distinctions between Matthew and other Gospels, see the introduction to Mark. So that's what I've got so far. There's a lot there in the themes. Did you want to go over anything in there in particular before we go on, or? I think you might be muted there. I'm not sure.
Yes, I sure was. No, I think I'm good for now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll kind of cover it over with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which is the... let me just... This is very bright and white, and I need to put it in dark mode. Sorry. Oh, oh God. Okay.
Everything should be in dark mode these days.
It's
Our
not an
eyes are too
option for some
sensitive.
reason. So I'm using U version, or Bible.com's thing, and we're using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which is not a very typical version of the Bible. And I'll just do a quick note on this. The differences between biblical scholarship are between two scales. It's a spectrum, if you want to call it that. The furthest end is thought for thought, and the other end is word for word. And this one is pretty much smack dab in the middle. So thought for thought is taking what somebody said, trying to digest what they meant by it in their original language, and then translating into well, in this case, English. Whereas word for word is, if the Greek says this, then we find the closest matching word in English and we write that down. And so that's sort of the spectrum. That's the scale of how biblical scholarship works, and which is why you have so many different versions, is because some people believe that it's the word of God and you have to have exactly every word written exactly like it was supposed to be written. And other people are like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because the word for, love in the Greek, there's 7 words, so, and there's only one word in English for love. So it's better to say how somebody was saying the word love and express it more accurately in a sentence. And so but people are saying, but you're adding then. So that's where that argument, or that's why you have so many translations of the Bible anyway. So this starts off in the first, I think it's 18 verses? 17 verses is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So this is primarily meant to show that the whole Old Testament, which is from the book of Genesis to Micah, the prophet, that all those things, that Jesus was descended from that Jewish line, all the way back to Adam and Eve. So he was a son of Adam, like one of the first people ever created, at least from that story's viewpoint, to the line of David, to the last kings that existed. And so when Israel was a nation originally. And that's what this is all about. So yeah, did you want to read this part?
Sure. The genealogy of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. From Abraham to David. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Fathered Aram. Aram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab.
Rahab, yeah.
Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David.
Mm-hmm. We had a good time in Bible class, just like seeing who could pronounce what. It's always a good time.
Got it. I'm usually pretty good at pronouncing
Yeah,
names.
I think you're doing great.
For things. I second guess myself sometimes.
That's good.
All right. Then, from there, David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat.
Yep.
Jehoshaphat fathered Joram. Joram fathered Uzziah. Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh fathered Amon. Amon fathered Josiah. And Josiah fathered Jeconiah. Jeconiah. That's like the hardest one of this whole list.
Jeconiah, or it's usually Yeconiah or Jeconiah. Something
Jeconiah.
Like that. Yeah.
Got it. And his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon.
Mm-hmm. Exile. Sorry.
From the exile to the Messiah. After the exile to Babylon, Jehoniah fathered Shealtiel.
Yep.
Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel fathered Abiud. Abiud fathered Eliakim. Eliakim fathered Azor. Azor fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Akim. Wait.
Akim, yeah, something like that.
Akim. Yeah, my eyes flickered and I lost my place.
It's all good.
So many letters. Akim fathered Eluid. Eluid fathered Eleazar. Eleazar fathered Mathan. Mathan fathered Jacob. And Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David until exile to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah is 14. Okay, we've got 3 sets of 14 here.
3 sets of 14, which is of course a derivative of 7, which is the holy number, which is why you have.
Of course,
numbers are very important to the Jewish people, and Matthew's all about numbers because he's a tax collector. Right?
Interesting. So. It's interesting seeing all the different lines coming up to the birth of Jesus.
Yeah. Now, what's really so what you've just read essentially is last time on Dragon Ball Z. So basically what all this did was gave you, so a person who is Jewish at this time would have read all of the Jewish manuscripts. Right, all of the Old Testament in what Christians believe in too, and each person in this is meant to evoke a particular story. And so, what I'll do, I'll go as fast as I possibly can to give you a very cursory overview of what happened prior to this thing. So, you obviously have the Adam and Eve story, which is actually, interestingly enough, not mentioned in this one. It is mentioned in Luke. Luke goes all the way back to the Son of God, or sorry, so Adam, the Son of God, right?
Yeah.
Because what Luke is focused on is trying to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. Right now, Matthew is trying to show that God came and became a human being who is Jesus Christ. So there's those 2 points. The 2 points that they're trying to make in 2 different books, essentially, which is why we're going to read these, and they're going to be not exact copies, but you're like, I've heard this story before. Didn't that guy already mention that? But they have a different eye perspective. They have a different lens that they're viewing through. Anyway, so the earliest idea is that basically in Genesis, God created Adam and Eve. They were exiled because they disobeyed basically the only command that they made, which is don't touch that fruit on that tree, which everybody says is an apple, but it probably wasn't an apple. It's always depicted that way. And then they went out, and this was likely in the land of Mesopotamia or Babylon, in that sort of that larger area. Eventually you got to the idea of the person named Abraham. Abraham was this person who was called by God and said, okay, you're in this particular land, but just pick up everything you have and go all the way to the west to this particular land that I've called for you. This is your land. And this is where the whole story of Israel comes from, which is actually really pertinent right now, because you have this big, Israel, Palestine kind of area. At least, so this is what the text is suggesting, that Israel has owned this land. It's been written about for thousands of years now. And that's kind of what the thing was. Anyway, so Abraham has a family. He is thought to be truly faithful, is willing to sacrifice his own son to follow God, because he is supposed to be this man of God, that he has trust, he has faith. And at the last moment, he's like, no, okay, I get it. You believe in me. That's great. Don't kill your kid, So that's an old story, right?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah. And so that line goes up to Jacob. Jacob was, was sort of like a brother to a different guy, not Saul. Anyway, so it kind of goes down the lines, and these are all different biblical stories within that line. Eventually, it goes to King David. David was the shepherd, right? He had a sling. He beat up a lion and a wolf with the sling and everything like that. He ends up becoming the right-hand man, or he starts off as basically a bard, essentially. If you like D&D, he just plays the lute for King Saul. And King Saul was apparently, whether he was schizophrenic or we don't know, right? Maybe he was demon possessed. We just don't know. But every time David played the lyre or the lute or whatever he was playing, he calmed him down. He ended up becoming like this great warrior. Hey, Shanna. Classic. Welcome in, Shanna. Thanks for joining in. So the classic story is that David ends up being like the only brave person in Israel. You have this giant called Goliath, right? The David and Goliath story and everything like that. And basically, King Saul is like, I don't really want to fight this army. We'll go champion to champion. And they bring out Goliath, and, David's like, let me fight him. He's like this 5'5", kid, teenager, and all he's got is a rock and a piece of string. And, famously knocks him in the head, grabs Goliath's sword, chops off his head, and he's like, we win. Completely decimates the entire army because of that, all that. So big stories, right? So that's what this whole thing is. So David becomes king after Saul refuses to assassinate him, even though he has every ample opportunity to kill the king if he wants to, because the king's after him at some point because he goes kind of nuts, and ends up having a son named Solomon, that with basically cheats, on, or because it basically has an infidelity with a different soldier's wife, and basically murders. So David is considered in scripture the best dude. Like, he is the most awesome guy, and yet he falls short. And that's a pretty important point, is every person in the story is meant to be a godly man, but they always fall short. And no matter what they can do, they can't actually save anybody. They can't even save themselves. And that's the whole story, fundamentally.
We're only human.
Exactly. And that's exactly it, which is why we need somebody more than human to help us. And that's the whole concept, right? That's kind of being said here. Anyway, so he goes through a whole bunch of different kings that were the story ends up going through kings that were more godly and kings that were really, really not godly, putting up like idols and crazy, hoodoo stuff, and it just absolutely ruined everything, sort of thing, until finally as one of the promises was made by God early on, by his prophets, they saying, if you keep screwing up the land that is supposed to be the holy land that I set aside for you, I'm going to kick you out and bring people out, some other people in here. And that's what the exile ends up happening. So they get exiled to Babylon. Babylon comes in, war, takes half the people. The first half was in Israel properly, and then Judah, which was two different parts of the nation, gets to stay. And then a couple of generations later, that king pisses off Babylon again, and they come and take them all back. And so they all go into exile. And then finally, the last part of the story is they finally get to come back. They not only get to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, in Israel, but they also get to build the temple. And that's where we end up finding the story set, is first century Judea in Jerusalem, well, essentially. And that's where the story of the New Testament comes in. And that's when Jesus kind of comes on the scene. So that's the really truncated version of the Old Testament, and basically what this first genealogy is trying to express.
Right.
So
that's interesting to think about, that just the story of all that, thinking about how things are still going on today between those two factions, more or less.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you have the Semitic Jewish people, and the not only those who are blood related in terms of they know and that's why this is so important. They're very big on their genealogy. You have to prove that you are actually blood related Jewish, or that your parents became Jewish through conversion, which is something that they do and everything, and that you can track it. And if you have your citizenship in Jerusalem and everything like that, the Jewish people are like, well, then come on over. You get a free trip. Come visit, because you are a part of our people, and they really take that seriously, right? So very interesting. So okay, did you want to read the rest there?
Sure. The Nativity of the Messiah. 18. The birth of Jesus Christ came about this way. After his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, it was discovered before they came together that she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. So her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her publicly, decided to divorce her secretly. But after he had considered these things, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because what has been conceived in her is by the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. See, the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel, which is translated, God is with us. When Joseph got up from sleeping, he did as the Lord's angel had commanded him. He married her, but did not know her intimately while she gave birth to a son, and he named him Jesus.
Indeed they did. So this is when I take out my massive Bible book, and there is a ton of different notes about this section that I thought it'd be cool to go over.
Supposedly Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus.
That's right. So that's what they're claiming here, is that, Mary was a virgin, that there was a spontaneous generation of DNA or being in the womb, and whether or not that's true, I mean, it's for other people to decide. To me, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, that makes me think, if they're focusing so much on Joseph's family line, what about Mary's family line?
Exactly.
Where'd she come from?
Ironically, from also David, which is what's interesting. So you find that out in Luke. So Matthew is primarily interested in the father lineage of Jesus, the legal lineage. So because Matthew is familiar, right? So he is heir, literally to the throne based on familial lineage, because the way that back in the day it was always lineage by sons, right? So this person's a son and that person's a son, so he's a son of the king and therefore he's going to be the future king, right? And so that's what Matthew is focused on, whereas Luke, I believe it's Luke and his genealogy, those are the two different genealogies. Luke is primarily focused on the biological connection to David. So if you find out that Joseph and Mary are distant cousins, right? Which a lot of Jewish people are, right? They all have that same familial. Now they might be super distant. They have those different family lines, right? Which are all going back to, you know, Jacob and his brothers, Benjamin, you know, all those guys, right? So Joseph, you know, you remember Joseph as well. That's another big story in there. So anyway, so they're trying to take a different point, right? So the idea of the humanness of Jesus is focused on in this particular one, right? And his human lineage in the kingdom side of things. Whereas, Mary's like, he's God in human flesh kind of thing. And that he's still descended from David, you know, the king. Okay, if you guys have any questions out in the audience as well, please feel free. You're welcome. If there's something that stands out, I welcome every possible question, detractor, everything. Again, at the start of this, I expressed how I was the most hostile to Christianity you can be. So when I started writing letters to my buddy Grant, well, buddy, he wasn't really my buddy at the start, but I was trying to save him from his Christianity, right? But I wrote question after question, like, this doesn't make sense, and why is it like this, and yeah. So feel free to ask any question. This is an apologetics Bible that I'm reading from, and so some of the things that come up commonly are written down here. And in this one it says, in identifying Jesus as son of David and son of Abraham, Matthew linked Jesus to the Davidic messianism of the Old Testament. So for those who don't know what the Messiah is, it is basically the one promised to come. It was thought originally to be just a kingly figure. So he is the coming king who will save and redeem. They thought literally a king to come and reestablish the dominance and rule of Israel over the world, essentially. Now, maybe not in a strong arm way, but as a moral center for the world kind of thing. It's like, this is the king that you really want to know. He's the most powerful, he's the most righteous, he's the guy, right? And so that's what that is referring to anyway. This connection is suggested in the Davidic covenant and explicitly expressed in the prophets. Matthew also linked Jesus to the Abrahamic covenant, in which God promised to bless all nations of the earth through Abraham's seed. The two covenants are brought together in Psalm 72. Jesus' Davidic descent was not a theological invention of the early church, therefore. It was attested as early as Paul and in a letter to the Hebrews. Furthermore, Jesus' immediate family, which was prominent in the early church, would have had to accept this claim. So just as Jews today basically have to go back and say, what's your genealogy and how far back does it go to prove that you're Jewish, to have a Jewish citizenship, the Jewish people of that day had to do the same thing. So that's why this genealogy is there, is to say, this is a legal document. This is a legal explicit claim that Jesus is the son of David and the son of Abraham, and therefore has the rights that come with that.
Yeah.
The Talmud, a collection of Jewish rabbinical writings, repeatedly charges Jesus with being born out of wedlock. For example, to Pandera, a Roman soldier. So this is a polemic against Jesus' lineage, but there is no polemic against Mary's or Joseph's lineage. So basically, polemic means something, a document or an explicit detractor of something, right? So basically, they're trying to illegitimize Jesus, but not Mary and Joseph. Those guys they are proven to be Jewish, kind of thing. And of course, the question of the virgin birth and everything like that. That's where the the question comes up, basically.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. There is evidence that first-century Jews kept genealogical records. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus referred to public registrars as sources of some of his information. Matthew's genealogy emphasizes Christ's royal lineage, while Luke's focus on his biological lineage. See, I knew it. I knew I was talking about something I remembered.
Yeah, that's exactly what you said earlier.
Yeah. For more about the differences between the genealogies, see the note in Luke chapter 3:23. Here's a good one. So this is where some of the differences end up coming up. Matthew omitted several names in his genealogy in order to maintain a 3 times 14 generation structure. Matthew was emphasizing Jesus' birth as a culminating moment in Israel's history. The third set of 14 has only 13 names in it also, unless one counts Jeconiah a second time, or the second set has 15 if one begins with David. Perhaps Matthew reflected the common feeling of his time that Jeconiah could be considered both a pre-exilic and post-exilic figure, because he was both present before the exile and after, essentially, right? David is a central figure in the lineage of Jesus. When the consonants of the name are added, the sum is 14, hence the importance of the number 14 to Matthew. David is the 14th entry in the genealogy. Luke, so what you can see is the Jewish people and the way they wrote things were very poetic. They have everything in sort of rhyme and everything like that we miss every time we start reading the Bible, right? It's like the serpent was slithering, right? It's in the Jewish way of saying it, it would be like saying the cat with the hat, right? They have a very poetic way of writing that often gets kind of missed, kind of thing. And that's really cool. I just think it's a really beautiful, way of telling a story anyway.
Yeah. And
so Matthew kind of catches that and uses his own kind of poetic way of doing things with numbers, kind of thing. So that's the...
yes, someone who can't seem to learn another language. English is all I've really known, and English has a very particular way of saying things, while some other languages have like a looser way of expressing what they're trying to say. And I guess that makes sense why you're saying earlier, where it's like when they're translating it, are they translating it word for word or meaning for meaning?
Yeah, thought for thought or whatever. Yeah, and it is because English is kind of a bit of a bastardized language, right? It's a derivative of all these different languages that are kind of shoved together. Whereas, a lot of the ancient languages, they were very explicit. They meant very specific things by a specific word, right? They weren't as casual. And if they were, it was sort of in common parlance. But in a lot of their writings and everything like that, they were like, no, there's an actual word for that, And so that's why when somebody says, I love you, like even me, like I'm biased against that word. I just am. Because I want to know,
too, actually.
I want to know what you mean by that. Do you mean philo, which is brotherly love? Makes sense, right? I can say that with sibling love, so I philo my brother, I philo my sibling. Makes sense, right? If somebody is talking about eros, though, if it was like a romantic relationship, well, eros is more about lust. It's more about, I'm sexually attracted to you, right? It's made off the cuff with passion and stuff like that. If somebody says agape, which means self-sacrificing, I love you so much that I'm actually willing to sacrifice my good to make sure that your good is at the highest of my priority. That's something serious to be said, and you don't say that lightly. And so when somebody's so my point simply being is language does matter, and what you say matters, and how you say it, kind of thing, right? So anyway, that's I'm
What
biased.
were those three again? Agape, Eros, and what was the first one?
Philo. Like so Philadelphia, right, is the city of brotherly love because it's philo, the philo, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that in the Greek there's 7 different words for love. I don't know them all off the top of my head.
Kind of makes sense, to be honest.
Yeah. So there's family love in general, which is like for an actual like, traditional family. Brotherly love is kind of more specific. My girlfriend is Finnish and won't say I love you to anyone but me, not to friends, not to family. That's amazing. That sounds awesome, man. Yeah, and I think again, it's people toss the word around a little bit too
much, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to, I'm sure people mean it in the way that they mean it, right?
Right.
But I don't know if they know what they mean, sort of thing, right? Like, I love you guys is not the same as I absolutely am devoted to you. It's a totally different level of love, right? Like, I'm willing to, and that's why, the whole concept of the cross and Jesus and everything like that he loved the whole world, which you'll come up to at some point, that he would die for the whole world. That use of love, that word that's used in that script, is agape, that he was willing to sacrifice himself. That's how much he loves. That's how much God loves. So when people say some, kind of a trite saying now, but that God is love, he's not saying that he loves in an eros way or in a brotherly way or in a casual way. He means it and in a sense of God's willing to die for you as much as he can die for you, right? And that's a pretty, again, that's not a casual thing to be tossed around, is the point, right? It's a language thing. That's cool, man. I think there's a passage in here, I'm just looking for it, about the actual virgin, because that's something that comes up a lot is, well, was Mary a real virgin? How are you supposed to know, right? That's a legitimate, question.
It's a logical thing to think about.
Right. It's like people just don't spontaneously generate human beings. It requires 13 alleles on one's, or is it 13? No, it's 26 altogether, sure. Right? I think it's 13 from mom and 13 from dad to make a human being with 26 alleles in their DNA structure. And if you don't have both, you don't have a human being, right? It just, there's no generation of human beings. So perfectly legitimate question. Let me see here. This passage, okay, so this is something about Joseph. So one of the things that are up here is they were engaged to be married, essentially, in the way that they're meant to be married. And Joseph basically says, you know what? That's cool. I'm just gonna divorce her, because it was actually a serious thing to get engaged. It was like we just have the ceremony, but you basically are two, one flesh kind of thing at that point, even though you weren't really supposed to be sleeping around back then, I guess. But so this passage, unique to Matthew, shows the exemplary character of Joseph. He did not question the angel's explanation for Mary's pregnancy. He obeyed without question what the angel told him to do, going ahead with his plan to take Mary as his wife. Now, my question usually ends up going to, and it shows that Joseph originally just assumed that Mary got pregnant, whether on her own desire or not, and it took a divine intervention to convince him, no, legit, she did not cheat on you, and so don't worry about it. We got your back, type of thing, And it does. It takes a good deal of character for somebody to, I think, take care of somebody else's kid, technically, right? Yes. I mean, it's not his. So
agreed. Also, for the DNA thing, it was 12 of each.
Is it 12?
24 nucleotides long.
Oh, okay. I thought it was 26 for some reason. Good to know. Here we go. Matthew cited the Greek version of Isaiah 7:14 virtually verbatim, including the Greek word, parenthenos, or virgin. The underlying Hebrew word alma means something like a marriageable girl. It probably also refers in the Old Testament to virgins. In Proverbs 30 has been suggested as a counterexample, but is obviously not such. For more on the virgin birth of Jesus, see note on Luke. Okay, so we'll get to more on this. I knew there was something in Luke as well for the virgin birth stuff. The name Jesus, Yahweh saves, describes what Jesus does. Emmanuel, God with us, describes who Jesus is. Matthew included the prophecy to assert the divinity of Jesus as well. Oh, random thing. A lot of people don't believe also that. So here's where the delineation between Catholic and Protestants already starts to go. So there's two different sects. Well, there's three actually. There's Eastern Orthodox as well. But Catholics still believe in Mary as a perpetual virgin, that she had Jesus and then never had a kid again. It's like, it takes a lot of belief in my mind to think that Joseph would get to marry a girl and then never get to sleep with her ever again. That she was always going to be virginal. And that's what Catholics kind of believe. So I'm not of that camp. If you believe that, that's fine. I don't think it's something to divide on, but it's certainly, I don't know. You're going to marry and have a girl and have her kid that's not yours, and then just be okay with it from there on out. It's like you tend to marry a girl not just to be able to build a family, not just for, the pleasure of a girl, I suppose, but ideally also to build a family and protect them and stuff. So the idea that Jesus had brothers and sisters later on, I think is a perfectly reasonable position as well. So, and lots of people believe that. So. Okay. So with that being said, I'll gauge where you're at. That's kind of where my time was set for, is an hour and a half. That's kind of where we're hitting now. Did you want to try another chapter, or is that good for this week and kind of sit there?
It's entirely up to you. I don't really have any plans today. All
right. Well, I'm fine either or. I don't mind jumping into Fortnite right after this personally, which is what I was going to do, because that's what I've sort of set up.
I'm fine with that.
But yeah, if you guys have any other questions, I think I'll stop there because we've gone through quite a bit, especially because we went through that earlier article and everything like that. But yeah, I welcome literally anything about this. If you feel like you don't really want to ask something on stream or have your name tagged to it or anything like that, I'm 100% willing to do the confidential thing. You can hit me up on Instagram or whatever. I have a couple of these things. Instagram, we got Twitter.
So you said you're not a TikTok person, right?
I am not usually a TikTok person, no.
I think you should.
I think I should.
For one thing alone, TikTok Live. So people not in America need at least 1,000 followers to be able to go live on TikTok, but you get actually a lot of engagement on there. The algorithm and the reach of that platform is actually really good. And if you have a very specific theme to your channel, you will get the traffic essentially. So might be something to look into, especially for these kinds of interactions with the Bible and theology and apologetics and all that.
Well, perhaps I will finally look into it then. Who knows? That's
it came to my mind, especially when you were talking about like other people, because you can also have other random people request to join your stream. You can let on, and it's just them on the camera. They can choose video or not. and there's also chat or whatever. That, yeah. If you get a little following, it's definitely something to look into if you do want some greater engagement on these kind of topics, which I think would be really good. I had you on speaker when I was showering there, and Winter is like, wow, he really has a good voice for this, because that's all she heard was your voice. I'm like, wow, he's got a nice voice.
Appreciate that. Yeah, no, it's I try, I guess.
Yeah, and you can still be on video. You can edit the TikTok stream. I'm pretty sure there's a way you can do it from your computer as well. Maybe not as much customization as like Streamlabs or OBS, but definitely something to look at if you want to get bigger and more interaction with these topics.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's I think it'd be fun to see what's out there. I have no real like grand design or aims or anything either, right? So in my mind, it's my I know
this is good enough for you too. Even just a couple people, and even having just me on here is
exactly
is really enjoyable.
Well, what's interesting for me is I've read the Bible back, cover to cover, I think at least 3 times, and then I did like what I'm doing here. I mean, I've done what I mean is like I've sat down and read from one side to the other.
That's good. I know I have never done that.
It takes a really long time. It is.
I can bet.
Look, let's be honest. This shit is boring sometimes. We just went through 17 lines of just genealogy. That's boring for people who don't know or don't really care about such things.
Yeah.
I totally get it. I'm not the guy. I don't like, it's just that but on top of the cover to cover thing, I also went to Bible college, which forces you to literally go through every book of the Bible and go fine tooth comb the darn thing, right? Now,
I know we were given assignments in Sunday school, but I can't really tell you what the heck it was that I was reading.
I couldn't tell you jack about anything. My primary issue in the past didn't actually have a lot to do with the Bible. I usually attacked the Bible because I just didn't like Christians or people who claimed to be Christian, right? And so a lot of the Catholic Church controversy and everything like that, I did not want to be associated with a group that seemed to grab priests who were hurting kids and then send them off to a new jurisdiction without any criminal, stuff. So that doesn't sound like a very nice, godly thing to do. So if that's what Christians are like, well, they can all go to hell, right? Like literally, they could. Like that's how I felt, and so I was very hostile. But I do think that there's a big disconnect if that's what people think is taught or exemplified in this thing, right? If this book, is, if you think that there's an equation there, it's just not. Now, that's not to say there aren't difficult things discussed in the Bible, and that's what I like about it, because it makes you really start thinking. It's like, well, that doesn't seem very nice, or that's not very good. Mm-hmm. Just look up Job. If you ever want like a really good example of some dude that gets seemingly just screwed over by God and the devil, the entire book, except for the last paragraph, is Job getting shat on. Not just shat on by them, but his best friends are sitting there, oh, well, it must be your fault. You must have screwed up some way for God to allow you to suffer so much. Wow. And that's the whole point of the book, is that suffering can't be, it's meant to describe the problem of people saying, if you do good, then good things will happen to you, and if you do bad, bad things will happen to you. It's such a childish, it's not childish, it's a childlike understanding of good and evil. And that whole book is meant to highlight, saying that's just not the way the world actually works, right?
Yeah, so, isn't that sort of where like karma can be folded in there too?
Right, exactly. The idea of karma, that, well, if something bad happens to you, don't worry, it'll balance out in the end. And that's just not true of reality. Anybody who really looks around right, will recognize that that's not the way shit works. At least so far as I can tell, that's not the way shit works, kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
that's where I think of like reincarnation and like past lives and paying for things
right.
in your previous lives. But
Right. Well, and exactly. I mean, that's a Buddhist side of things that I've read. Right. Is, but where the idea of that cycle of rebirth, the irony of Buddhism is that karma is not a good thing. That karma is actually a prison. Buddhists, the whole concept of a Buddhist is to get out of that cycle of rebirth because it's not good. That's what nirvana is an escape from that cage, to a recognition that you're in. It's almost like a Matrix thing, really. It's the idea is like, man, you're in a cage, you're in the Matrix. Get the hell out of the Matrix. You don't want to be in here.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really what it is. And that's laudable, but then again, it's also a question of from a theological point of view or philosophical point of view is how do you reasonably deduce that reality? Like, how do you figure out if that's true? And that's the problem, right? Like, you can, to me, it's just as likely, at the very least, just from removing the theology of it, but just the philosophy of it, right? It's just as likely that people came up with the concept of rebirth to explain why people get a bad go of it in life, right?
Yeah.
Rather than that being true. It's like, well, you see, it's because we existed before and you really fucked up in the last round. And so now that's why you're getting shat on. It's like, okay, but I mean, like, how do you know that? Where does that come from? And so, that's where a lot of the interesting, and again, really interesting concepts, really interesting discussion to have. And so perfectly willing to go there at some point. It's been a long time since I've really dived into the Buddhism because, I thought it was a good stepping stone for me in any case. So.
Yeah, I never really delve into it too much. It on the surface seems pretty spiritual and awesome and whatnot, but I mean, I do like the idea of like getting over the materialness of this world, not focusing so much on the material and accepting that life is life and shit happens.
Yeah, the nature of and what's interesting is there are, like I think I said before early on, is there are actual parallels in most religions, right? There's parallels where they're touching on the same reality that people are experiencing, right? And that's really, so the idea of suffering being a part of impermanence is a really cool concept. And by cool, I mean accurate perception of reality, right? And that really freed me up a lot in trying to not, because I was such a micromanaging, I don't know, call it mastermind. I thought that I was so amazing that I could pull the strings and control freak. I was just a control freak, right? And when it didn't go my way, that's when there's cognitive dissonance, where my brain is starting to feel like sound waves are just blowing it up, but that's all internal. That's all you hurting yourself.
That's right. And you're definitely not the only one. There's so many people that like they want to control the things that they can't actually control. And what was the I don't remember the name of the verse, but it was
do unto I don't know. Tomorrow has enough trouble for itself, or today has enough trouble for itself. So.
That I cannot sing. Serenity Prayer.
Oh.
God, give us the courage to change what must be altered, serenity to accept what cannot be helped, and insight to know the one from the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and it's very, very often quoted prayer, right? Because it's...
Yeah. I guess the other way, the other words is serenity to accept what cannot be changed, the courage to change what can be changed, and the wisdom to know
The difference.
the difference.
That's right.
Yeah, I do like that. So yeah, I definitely accept those things that I can't change. The things that I can change, I'll definitely put the effort and absolutely the serenity into changing, even if it is like myself for the better. And having the wisdom to know the difference is the third part that makes it all go together.
True story. Cool. Well, with that quick version of the prayer, I think that's probably a good place to stop for this particular side of the stream.
Yeah.
Hey, really appreciate you suffering through it and figuring it out. Yeah, we're kind of getting into the Christmas story a little early because that's what this is really about, is the birth of Jesus, and that's what that whole Christmas period is about, right? So this was fantastic. Thanks, man. Thanks, Shoes. Appreciate you popping in and hanging out.